So today we're going to be talking about the future of maybe 2024 in terms of climate as we head into later into the year, as we get through spring and into summer, preparing for next hurricane season in the Atlantic, Eastern Pacific, and then typhoon season in the Western Pacific. So we'll get to talking about that soon. But the first thing we're going to talk about is the Southern Oscillation Index. This is an index that explains the atmospheric patterns in the Southern Pacific between Tahiti and Darwin. A negative pressure sign, as seen here for the last 30 days and 90 days, is pressure being lower in Tahiti than is in Darwin. And if it's positive, pressure is higher in Tahiti than is in Darwin. So generally, for this graph, above -7, below -7 on the Southern Oscillation Index indicates you're in El Nino type atmospheric conditions, where there is less trade winds in the tropical Pacific, and even a westerly wind there component to the wind that's not too strong, that allows the waters off of South America and in the Central Pacific to warm up fairly quickly, while there's less warm water being pushed towards Australia and Indonesia. So there is less warm water there, so that leads to drought usually. And there's also usually a increase in trade winds in around Indonesia because there's less trade winds around in the Pacific to compensate for the rising air. So sinking air has to be over Indonesia, and that ramps up the trade winds, bringing a cool pool of water up from below due to upwelling. So as of recent times, the SOI has been going up and down. It's been fluctuating, but in general, the trend overall, at least in the daily contributions, there have been some 12s, some 10s, but generally it's pretty stable right now. The 90-day average has steadily come up from December. It was at an 8 in December, and now it's at a 5, -5. So this is transitioning towards neutral conditions more often. So we're slowly getting El Nino's influence is slowly starting to break away here. And as time goes on, as we see up here, the influence of El Nino is starting to break down, and that's something that's going to be more pronounced as we hit the spring due to cold water, which is, if I look at the anomalies, we have cooler water starting to build up in the Northeast Pacific, and have cooler water starting to build in the Southeast Pacific, in the Southeast Pacific around South America, around the latitude of Chile. Starting to get cooler water here, starting to build up, and eventually these two factors should strengthen and should really start knocking down the El Nino by the time spring arrives in about 2 or 3 months. If I look at ENSO conditions, this is the official NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. This is the United States government organization. So the probabilities of the El Nino Southern Oscillation maintaining El Nino is supposed to continue for the rest of the winter. This is pretty much guaranteed. But as we get into spring, chances begin dropping, and as we approach summer, chances begin to really start dropping off until around 10% down here. Anything this far out, like 10%, is fairly low and will most likely not happen by this time. And as you can see, La Nina's chances to begin growing as time goes on. So by the time we're approaching the peak of hurricane season, we are now at about a 44% chance of either a La Nina or neutral conditions, which for the Atlantic is good for hurricane season for number of storms. It's bad if you live on land, because the La Nina reduces wind shear over the Atlantic by producing sinking air over the Pacific because of the cold water. So that increases sinking air over the Pacific allowing more air to rise over the Atlantic, leading to less wind shear. And that easterly jet that comes off of Africa like this, I can draw it in a different color. The eastern jet that comes around like this can move farther west because there's not a upper level subtropical jet that's stopping it as it gets into the Caribbean. So storms have an easier time to develop since there's less wind shear. And if we combine that with the fact that the majority of the Atlantic is warmer than normal, especially in, let me get my pen here, especially in the eastern Atlantic, going up into the northeast Atlantic, around the British Isles, Europe, and it's still very warm in the Caribbean. This is going to be concerning for peak season because the majority of tropical waves and storm systems that do get going in the Caribbean and the main development region, which is between. Although the main development region, if I were to delineate it, technically ends in the Caribbean, the open tropical Atlantic, south of 20 degrees north, which is this line here, south of this, that's generally where the majority of storms tend to develop or get their start in the Atlantic. So warmer waters here will just make it easier for them to get their kickstart, and warmer waters to the north will ensure that there's not as much cold water that can mix in and stop them from intensifying, and will keep those waters close to the tropics warmer, able to stay warm, in contrast to the Pacific, where the colder waters coming down from the mid-latitudes will keep the eastern tropical Pacific cooler, make it harder for it to warm up, unless they start to warm up within the next few months. So that, and plus there is a pocket of cooler water in the subtropics here, east of the United States and north of the Caribbean, but south of the Canadian Maritimes. So this will focus the majority of the rising air motion in this area right here, instead of having the issue of there's rising air in the subtropics and the tropics because it's all warm, so you have instability issues. This will force the rising air where the storms are most likely to develop, and that is going to allow storms that come off Africa or get in the Caribbean to develop pretty quickly, and we'll have an easier time to actually get organized compared to previous years, especially this year in the Caribbean, especially since there won't be shear coming across this way. The warm water was enough to still get Idalia to come out of here, but the overall steering pattern and dry air, well, not really dry air, but overall steering pattern kept the majority of storms going out to sea due to a low pressure system over the eastern United States, and the fact that wind shear from the El Nino to a degree kept the Caribbean on a cap for most of the season. And that's able to be seen in this right here. In the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season, this is the fourth most active season on record. 3 major hurricanes, which Idalia is there. I'll get a better color. Idalia was there. Idalia's right here. Lee was out here, and then it curved up into Canada later on when it got picked up by a trough. Franklin came into the Dominican Republic, re-strengthened after leaving the island, and then became a Cat 4, and then eventually moved northwest of Bermuda, and then transitioned to extratropical storm. But the vast majority of storms this year did not get into the Caribbean. Or the Gulf, or able to actually get into the southwest Atlantic. They weren't able to do it because of the steering patterns. Now, as far for next year, Tropical Storm Risk did release an update in December for an extended range forecast for the North Atlantic hurricane season next year. Now, it's still, until hurricane season, it's still 5 months, and until the peak is 8 months. But this can give us a general idea of what we're looking at. And they predict that the North Atlantic will be very active, with about 30% above the 30-year norm, and 50% around above the long-term norm, which is 1950 to 2023. As large uncertainties, though, since we haven't got into the spring where we can actually start measuring the wind patterns in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, we haven't gotten there yet. And then we actually do get in the season, we have to start measuring ocean temperatures and stuff like that, wind anomalies, before we can actually get a real sense of what the peak season is going to be like. But this is just a preliminary forecast based on what we already know. So ACE is looking at 160, 4 intense hurricanes, 9 hurricanes, and 20 named storms. So this would be this will be a very active season. It would technically be classified as an extremely active season, at least under NOAA's background of it, because an extremely active season has ACE above 159, so it would be classified as that type of season, just barely. But in that case, we're already looking at, based on what we have now, the Atlantic was the warmest it's been, at least in records last year, and that's what helped get the high amount of storms, but didn't really help get the high amount of hurricanes and major hurricanes out last year, mainly due to steering patterns and the wind shear capping off the Caribbean. So we're looking at forecast probabilities now. Looking at charts. So for their ACE, the 50% tile of exceedance, where it's a half chance of it happening, is right around 160 for their forecast. And that's higher than climatology. For most climatology, it usually peaks around, at least in recent climatology, it would peak around 120 something, like 120, 130, in the 30-year average of 1991 to 2020. So the ceiling of the season's higher than a normal season would typically be. And if we're looking at the 50% probability of hurricanes, we're looking at about 8 to 9 hurricanes. But even 10 and 11 still have decent chances before it really starts dropping off towards the end there. So we're still waiting on data for sea surface temperatures. They're using historical data to get this stuff. We have to look at the NAO, which is the North Atlantic oscillation. We have to look for that and see how La Nina evolves, as well as trade winds. So we have to see how these factors manifest in the season. Do we see the El Nino try to hang on a little bit longer, and by peak season we're in neutral conditions but not quite La Nina? Or does this El Nino here begin to degrade very fast and then begin to start tanking? That's what we have to start looking at. Does it begin tanking? Like, do we go from a 1.5 strength El Nino, which I could probably check here. If I go here, I think it's in analysis and tools. If I look at ocean analysis, it should be here. Yep, there we go. Nino 3.4. Open that up in a new tab. Okay. Let's get it here. Do we stay more steady in how we drop? We stay more steady, and then we eventually start dropping down slowly into a plateau like that. Maybe like some bumps in between. Or do we have a more fast drop? So where after we hit February or somewhere around March, it starts doing a steep drop, and then we start really getting into La Nina territory pretty quickly. Gotta see how that works. Because for most of the models, at least here, as you guys can see, we're at a 1.5 strength El Nino right now. So this is a strong El Nino, moderate to strong. And By peak season, the majority of models have us in neutral ENSO up here, approaching La Nina as we get near peak season. And then we have some that are in La Nina and then going even stronger. But this is from November. This updates. So we have to check in more often with this to see what changes in the future. So we'll have to see how the El Nino goes. But at least now for the winter, it's going to maintain itself. But we'll look at the NME model, because their new forecast that goes for about 9 months released recently. So we're going to be looking at precipitation and moisture patterns anomalies globally. So as you can see, we still have this large area of increased rainfall in the Pacific, mainly due to El Nino. And we have drier conditions in the tropics around Australia, South Indonesia, and a little bit wetter over Indonesia itself. So as time goes on, we'll switch these out. Keep going. If I can drag this. Okay, there we go. El Nino still maintains itself. Those anomalies are still green. But as we enter April, they start disappearing. And then we start moving into May. They start drying out. And by June, almost this entire area switched from above normal rainfall to below normal rainfall by a considerable amount. And as we keep going into July and to August, it stays the same. September, while this area in Indonesia and around Australia gets a lot wetter in comparison. We'll also look at sea surface temperature anomalies by the time we get here. By this time, according to the NWLME model, this is UK Met model, we have a decent sized La Nina on the global picture, while the Atlantic is still warmer all around, with most of the warmest water in the Caribbean, in the Canary Current, northeast, but northeast there. But we have like a tiny patch of cooler water in the subtropics. So we'll just look at that evolution again. This is pretty far out. But as we get towards March is when El Nino begins to disintegrate. According to NWME, we start getting cooler water anomalies appearing near South America as we get trade winds that begin to blow stronger across the ocean, upwelling the water off South America and bringing up that cold water from the depths below. And then that keeps increasing as time goes on. And by June, you have a decent amount of cold water in the Eastern Pacific, in the tropical Eastern Pacific. And then that continues to strengthen the closer to September we go. While the Atlantic at that time is still very warm. So in this scenario, there wouldn't be much wind shear that would be coming across like that. That would not really be happening. And a lot of the rising air motion, which I'll label in green and have big arrows for this. A lot of rising air motion in this scenario will be here over the Atlantic. It will be sinking over the Pacific. You'll have rising air over the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean, most likely. This is where the strongest rising air will probably be. So I'll actually go back and get a bigger arrow for these. I'll make the Atlantic arrow smaller. So the Atlantic, you'll get rising air here. And then the strongest rising air will be over the Indian Ocean and Maritimes. And this will help feed a tropical wave train over Africa as time goes on. Because more rising air in the Indian Ocean will lead to more tropical waves over Africa itself. Especially if there's rising air also over Africa. And that gives more waves that come off into the Atlantic. And then they can form up if they have favorable conditions. And I'll also draw the sinking area. So there is strong sinking air, which I'll actually put in gray. Actually, no, we'll use this color. Strong sinking air that's falling over the Pacific here. So, and then the net flow of air will be something where in the Atlantic there's weaker trade winds, and then in the Western Pacific there will be stronger winds. Now, we will zoom back onto the Atlantic specifically, and we'll go month by month here. Start going month by month. Already, the water's already warm in the Atlantic, so if there was a high pressure system sitting out here somewhere, probably wouldn't look exactly like that. But if there's a high pressure system that's funneling warm moisture back in to the United States like this, then severe weather in this general area would have more energy to work with, because there's still a decent amount of cold air that's coming down from Canada as storm systems move along the jet stream. And since there's also a subtropical jet that's sitting here, allowing more storm tracks to come through this area anyway, and then move up and possibly merge with a polar jet here, and then transition across the Atlantic. Because we have more storms coming through this area due to El Nino anyway, and we have a warmer Gulf, that gives storms more energy to build up, and to feed whatever severe weather outbreaks we have in this area through January, basically through most of severe weather season. As I get rid of this, the Gulf of Mexico does warm up more, even in May. So this continuous flow of warm, moist air into the Gulf that will just feed whatever storm system comes in here. Whatever storm systems come in here will be there. So there will be more warm air available for any storm systems that do get going. Now, here for the tropics, we'll switch to the precip model, because this is more important. Now, this is an important thing to mention. More precipitation doesn't mean more developed storms, more named storms. That's not what it means. It doesn't mean that there's more tropical systems. It just means that there's more rainfall due to more storms in that general area. But that doesn't mean they have to be developed or necessarily very strong. So in this situation, we have a large green pool of hidden moisture in the Caribbean due to the intertropical convergence zone down here in Africa, northern South America, and into the Eastern Pacific here. Right? We have an increased amount of rainfall. So this will mean more rainfall, or probably an earlier start to that wet season down there. More rainfall is available for any storms that do try to get going. More moisture is available for storms that try to get going. And that'll probably mean there's more tropical waves that are in this area in May at the time. And if we transition this to June, see how this changes. We start opening up the Gulf, where we have still high precipitation rates in the Caribbean and in the Gulf. So this to me would say tropical waves are coming around like this, and then getting in the Caribbean, and then either going out, or you have them forming and developing and then getting into the Gulf, or whatever, or you have a cold front that has come down from the United States, just like that, or draw it like that, and then you get a low that spins up along this line, and then it moves somewhere within the Gulf from there. We'll move this into July. And now the Caribbean's still wet. Gulf is still wet. Now, there's a dry patch here. So there's probably going to be less storms here. So this is probably where the high pressure is going to set up. As there's less rain here. This is the Gulf Stream, most likely. Less rain here. So there's probably going to be more high pressure and less storm tracks over this area at the southwestern Atlantic, specifically east of Florida. But in the Gulf, there's going to be more storms, more rain. So there's more opportunities for tropical systems to be in these areas and then develop if conditions are right. So most likely, if I were to draw the high pressure system from this angle, try and draw one, you most likely have a high pressure that will probably be like something like this. Probably not that high, but you have it like somewhere around here, because this is also dry. And then you have it somewhere like this. Have some high pressure that looks like this that prevents storms from the Caribbean from trying to go up and turn into that. That's going to be harder for storms to do, but it seems that if they come off Africa just like this and then move into the Caribbean and then start turning as they get into the Western Caribbean, that's more likely. But early recurvatures at this point doesn't seem too likely, except for maybe this little turn spot right here. It's a possibility. So we move on to August 2024. Now we open up a little bit more. Caribbean's still wet. Gulf is still wet. Now we start getting rid of this dry patch in the Southwest Atlantic Ocean. We start getting rid of it around the Bahamas. So this would allow more storms to actually start taking a more northward path. And then we see more rainfall starting to come up here. So maybe we start seeing more recurves as we get into August. But in general, most of the rainfall is not up there. Most of the rainfall is still closer to land. And if we take that in September, the last month, it's still generally the same thing. More reef seems to be more of a turn north later in the model, but the same thing is still a theme. It's still the theme. More rainfall and more storms, whether they be actual developed storms, tropical waves, or any genesis event plus cold fronts. More of that. Although if it was cold fronts, you would see more in the eastern United States in general. But more storm activity and lower pressures are going to be in the western part of the basin in general and through the main development region. Not too much storm activity in the open Atlantic up here. Not too much there. So this looks to be more of a season where if we do get those 20 named storms, those 9 hurricanes, and those 4 major hurricanes, the vast majority of them will be heading towards land, which will be a high impact season. And it only takes one storm, whether it be Ian or Idalia, an Ida, a Michael, an Irma, a Maria, Harvey, like a Matthew. It only takes one of those types of storms to ruin everything. An Imelda, for example, a tropical storm, like it was a tropical storm, but it dumped 40 inches of rain over southeastern Texas right here. It only takes one storm. And if there's more, in this scenario, there are more cases where you can get storms and more chances that one will actually come by and impact land in the Caribbean, in the Gulf. So this is the type of season where you probably want to start preparing more now and not later, because if this is true, where the majority of the storms will probably be moving towards land areas, this will be a high impact season alone just because the storms will be in proximity to land. And if we were to look at thermodynamics, sea surface temperatures, they have warmer waters to work with. They don't have wind shear on here. I could probably use like a Kansas model. Kansas model is pretty similar. Warmer water, which is focused in the Caribbean. We look at shear anomalies for this. That's not there. Yikes. 500 millibar height anomalies. You have stronger heights in ridging over the Canadian Maritimes and weaker over the Gulf average. So that funnels more storms into this area in general. So storms don't just curve out to sea in this pattern. Although in September it's more likely since this corridor opens up. But less storms will curve out to sea in this pattern. Like this right here. I think I can try and look at wind anomalies. I think this is what it will look like. But yeah, there's less wind shear over the Caribbean in general, just this purple. It's just more eastern winds at the top. So this is coming from the east, which is also the same direction the tropical cyclones will be moving. So there's less wind shear for them during the actual season as well. So this is not a very good sign for these areas. It's not a very good sign for the Atlantic hurricane season. So I would prepare for this one. So I'll keep you guys updated on this. So besides that, I think if we just look at globally, we'll go back to global trends, because this year was also pretty hot. If we look at like global trends, I would expect Eastern Pacific doesn't seem to have too much precipitation with it. So that looks to be a quieter season compared to this year, which is going to be a much needed reprieve after storms like Otis, Norma, Layla. I think I'm saying that wrong. I have to remember the storm names. I could probably find it on Wikipedia. But after 2023, the Eastern Pacific does need a break from hurricanes. They do need one, especially after Otis and what happened at Acapulco. From tropical storm to Category 5 hurricane in 24 hours. So, also seems to be wetter in East Asia, especially in India, for their monsoon season. The typhoon season, I have to look more into that and study it. Seems to be less water in the Philippines until around October, and then that changes. And I'll look at like the early part. So, yeah, it seems to be for peak season, at least in Australia, for their cyclone season, which is in March, which the peak is in March. There seems to be less moisture around Australia and Vanuatu, but more in the South Pacific and around New Guinea. So this is going to be an interesting season, see how that plays out. So, I'm going to end the video there. I think I've talked about pretty much everything that I wanted to mention. So I'll switch back to this. So this is where I'm going to be putting all my weather discussions from now on. Every single one we're going to be putting global stuff here. We're going to be putting tropical cyclone stuff here. Climate updates here. Almost everything will be going here. We'll just say that. Everything will be put in this section for people to view, and then it will be organized with the most recent stuff at the top, and the older stuff being at the bottom. So it's easier for you guys to always find the latest information for when I make it. Okay, guys. So I hope you guys learned something from this video and actually figured out something from the weather and what I've talked about in the video. So we mainly talked about the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season. It does look to be looking to be a pretty impactful season early on. With the limited tools we have, we still have to get into the spring and get through the spring predictability barrier and actually get the information from the areas with actual instrumentation. But once we get that data, then we can start really looking at, okay, this season is probably going to be this, and we're looking at these areas. We're going to have probably more storms based on where the storm track is going and where the heavy rains are. So then we can actually start from there. We have the information, and then we just start tracking everything, because we're going to probably start tracking pretty soon, in about 4 or 5 months. I can guarantee you we're going to be probably tracking at least something in May. But anyway, I'll see you guys in like another video. I'm going to try and make a different type of video afterward. But I'm going to save these links in a Discord PDF or something, just so I don't lose these for the actual video, and I'll make sure these are uploaded. This is uploaded for all the accurate information. Alright guys, I'll see you another day, and hopefully you have a good rest of your day, whatever day I upload this video, which will probably be not today. Today is Wednesday, but probably be on the weekend. All right, see you guys later.